Why stoicism? Why not Buddhism? Why not cynicism, skepticism, Christianity? Why stoicism and not all these other things? When I say why, I mean why should you study it? Why should you look into the Stoics, what they did, what they believed? And I believe it's because there's never been any more practical wisdom than in Stoicism. You can read Seneca, you can read Epictetus, and you can read Marcus Aurelius, and you can read Musonius Rufus, and there's lessons in there that you can apply to your life right then and there, and I believe your life will become better. And there's no there's no reliance on faith and belief in something that you have no way of knowing if it's real or not. It's practical wisdom for reality. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. It gives it to you. It gives it to you straight up. And Stoicism would rather be harsh, but get the point across to you than sugarcoat something and you not really get the point. But the main reason, I believe, is just the practical wisdom. How to live properly is all the Stoics cared about and all they wrote about. And the Stoic would say living properly consists of living in accordance with nature, in accordance with virtue and wisdom. And above all else, that's all the Stoic cares about. If he's living in accordance with his nature, if he's showing virtue and showing wisdom, then he is content. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions, I believe, with Stoicism nowadays, where a lot of people think it's about not showing your emotions or about you know being melancholy, just very timid, very to yourself, very enclosed, not really caring about what goes on outside of you. And to a certain extent, some of that is true, but to a bigger extent, most of that is false. The Stoic believes it's his duty to help out the fellow human race, believes it's his duty to be kind, to be just, to be courageous. These are the four Stoic virtues: is temperance, so essentially discipline, courage, justice, and wisdom. Justice is part of one of their virtues, and they believe. Marcus Aurelius says time and time again that he was born for the universe, the human race, for community. He was not born for himself. He says, what doesn't hurt the bee, or what doesn't hurt the hive can't hurt the bee. He looks at human race as a whole, and he needs to contribute to the human race from what fate and fortune has assigned him to do. And the Stoic would also say that no one can harm him or insult him. Seneca has a great essay on this. Talks about the wise man, and in this he talks about the Stoic sage, and talks about how he can neither be harmed nor insulted. And he talks about Cato, which is essentially the Stoic ideal. All the Stoics kind of look to Cato as the Stoic. He didn't leave any writing. He, like Marcus and Epictetus and Seneca and Musonius Rufus, so more people know their names. But Cato was what people say, or what the Stoics would say, was the ideal Stoic. He didn't need to write anything down to show that he was a Stoic. You just have to look at how he lived his life, they would say, and you could tell that he was a Stoic. And you could learn a lot about Stoicism from how he lived his life. But they say, Seneca says, and I believe all Stoics would agree, that the wise man is can neither be injured nor insulted, because he understands that anything outside of himself doesn't matter. The Stoics believe that anything that is not subject to will is indifferent. If you do not control it, then it means nothing to you. And they're clear in communicating the fact that there are preferable indifferences. And what I mean by that is, a Stoic, life and death is not in our control. So therefore, they would say it is indifferent. But that would be a preferable indifference, because obviously you prefer life to death. But when a preferable indifference arises and it doesn't make you sacrifice virtue or wisdom, then it's okay to go for it. But if you need to sacrifice virtue and wisdom to stay alive, then they say that would be a worse fate than dying. Because if you die keeping your virtue and keeping your wisdom and justice and courage and temperance, then that's a better fate than losing those, giving into vice and surviving. They would also say there's nothing wrong with money. Money is another preferable indifference, they would say. It's obviously people prefer to have money than not have money, but if you have to sacrifice any virtue for money, then you have failed and you're not living up to the Stoic ideal. And Seneca, like I said, has a great essay on that in this book right here if you want to read that, and a bunch of other amazing essays. Right now I'm reading on tranquility of mind, and he just talks about how, the Stoic, to have tranquility of mind, cannot put his well-being outside of himself, essentially. A Stoic's well-being is all internal. He doesn't seek meaning. He doesn't seek the meaning of life in external circumstances, in external situations and experiences. He seeks it in the internal and how he goes about living his life internally. That's how the Stoic sage, the Stoic wise man, goes about living life. I think there's connections between Buddhism and Stoicism in that regard, where the Stoic, they say temperance is one of the virtues, and the I forget the right terminology, but Buddhism has like the 8 ways of moderation or something like that, and it's basically just balance. It's basically the 8 ways that the Buddhist taught people, and the Stoic would say the same thing. Moderation, nothing in excess, Seneca says, and many of the Stoics echo that same phrase. But where they also converge with Buddhism, I believe, is in their views on desires and their view in if you desire something, you're bound to become miserable. The Stoics would say that, and Buddhists obviously say that. They say, I think, like, you got like the 4 noble truths, and one of them is that life is suffering because we desire. We just keep desiring and desiring and desiring. And the Stoics, they say you're bound to become miserable if you desire externals, because they're not within your control. If you desire anything outside of your control, it's subject to not happening, which will make you despair and be miserable. And even if it does happen, it's subject to be taken away from you at any moment, at any time. So you'll be living in anxiety by the idea that what you worked so hard, what you toiled so hard for, could potentially be taken away from you. So they say you should not desire externals. But this is where I like Stoicism so much better than Buddhism in that sense, because from my understanding, Buddhism tells you to have no more desires. But Stoicism tells you that's impossible. We're all going to desire. There's no way you can eliminate desire. But how Stoicism gets around this is through indifferences, preferable indifferences. It's like if you have a cup of, apple juice and a cup of orange juice, and you prefer the apple juice, but, you've been given the orange juice. They say, it's impossible for you not to desire the apple juice, but you need to view this as a indifference. It doesn't matter. Your life will not become worse and will not become better from having apple juice or orange juice. It doesn't, you don't sacrifice virtue, you don't sacrifice wisdom, you don't sacrifice courage, discipline, justice, none of that stuff. So they say, yes, you prefer apple juice, but if you get the orange juice, who cares? No, no reason to complain. It's trivial. Marcus Aurelius says how trivial the things we want so passionately are. And that's one of my favorite quotes from Meditations, because it is so true. The things we want so passionately are so trivial. You think, once I get this, I'll be happy. Once I obtain that goal in the future, then I can start living my life. I can start enjoying my life. I can, stop worrying. But that's not how it works. The things are truly trivial in the sense that they're not going to help your well-being. Oneself should be lifted up by oneself. And if you're, wherever you go, there you are, as the saying goes. And if you can't be happy internally, your external situation does not matter. And the saddest thing is when people seek validation and meaning from the external world when their internal world is distraught. Because then they ruin great experiences and great people, because they apply a notion that they need to give them something. You say say you're feeling down and you plan a trip to Hawaii, and you're feeling down, so you're like, all right, once I get there, I'll be happy. It'll be vacation time. I'll be able to enjoy myself. I'll have a good time. And then you get there and you realize the person who was making the situation so bad in the past was you. You were the person that was making the present so unbearable. And just because you've changed your external situation, your external experience, your external environment, you're still there. The person who's making life miserable is still with you, still as close to you as anything is. And then it's horrible because you put the pressure on Hawaii. You put the pressure on the place. You say, no, you were supposed to make me happy. You were supposed to give me meaning. You were supposed to get me out of this slump. So even though you're in a beautiful place on a vacation, you can't find happiness because the same person is with you that always brings you down, which is yourself. And that's why, I forget which Stoic says it, but a Stoic says, I think it's Epictetus. He says, how do you know you're becoming better at philosophy? Actually, I think it's Seneca. But he says, you're becoming better at philosophy when you start becoming a better friend to yourself. Because that's all that really matters. Throughout your life, like I said, wherever you go, there you are. Your internal state If your internal state is heavenly, then you will be able to smile even in hell. And if your internal state is hell, even in heaven, you will find a way to despair. And that's why the Stoics focus so much on their internal state and not letting the external world dictate their actions and dictate the way they feel, because they know it's subject to change. Marcus Aurelius has a quote, and it's more or less, the universe is change, life is opinion. And I like to kind of paraphrase that into, the universe is change, life is what we deem it to be. Life is opinion, life is what we deem it to be. The meaning of life is to give life meaning, as Viktor Frankl says. And life is what we deem it to be is an amazing realization, and a horrible realization. It's amazing in the way that if you agree with it, you can change your life like that. And no matter what you're going through, you can find meaning and you can become happy. But it's also dreadful because you realize all the times in your life you were unhappy, you were waiting to live, waiting to be happy. It was your own doing. It was in your hands. Meaning is in your hands. Being happy is in your hands. And that's another hallmark of the Stoic wise man, Seneca would say. Well, actually, he says the hallmark of a Stoic wise man is freedom from anxiety. The Stoic is never anxious, because the Stoic knows that whatever happens outside of him cannot disrupt his joy, because his joy is completely from inside. His joy is completely from himself. And a lot of people, I think, when you start saying stuff like that, they think that means, not serving humanity, not finding relationships valuable. But it's actually the opposite. It's paradoxical, as I often say philosophy is. And it's paradoxical because once you're happy with yourself completely, you're not seeking, like I said, you're not seeking joy from Hawaii. You're just going there and enjoying it for what it is. And if it doesn't live up to your expectations, you're not shunning it. And that's how you deal with people too. You don't go into an interaction with someone with a preconceived notion on how they need to act, how they need to be, how they need to mold to what you believe a good person should be for you to be happy and treat you respectfully and right. You don't need that from anybody. It's not in your control, so you shouldn't want it. And it can make the relationship so much more real, because you're not searching for anything from them. You're not telling them they need to be a certain way. You're allowing them to be themselves, and you're happy either way. And you're not trying to control them. And you're not saying, hey, be in a better mood. You're supposed to make me happy. It's selfish. It's selfish to think experiences in life are supposed to give you meaning, and people in life are supposed to give you meaning. You're putting too much pressure on things and people, when in reality, it needs to be on yourself. In reality, you are the only person that can give life true meaning and sustainable freedom. Sustainable meaning, because everything outside of you is subject to change. Say you find your purpose in life and you find your dream job, and then you get laid off. What good did that do you? You put all your meaning in an external, and now you're depressed again. For what, a year of quote unquote good times? Not how life should be lived. Yes, the Stoic would say, go out, find meaning, find purpose, but never rely on your well-being in these things. These things are not what make you you. They're not your identity. I've been thinking about a lot. I've been thinking a lot about identity recently because I listen and I guess you could say study a lot of you know meditation type people, and the concept of having no self, and what identity is and all that, because it's clear to me that you're not your job. And I also like know thyself is something I try to cultivate, because that was a phrase on the monument of Apollo, and it was very very meaningful to the Greeks. Socrates, it was very meaningful to Socrates. Knowing thyself, he believed, was a matter of utmost importance. And same thing with the Stoics. They were a branch essentially of Socrates' philosophy, and they cultivated the same importance in knowing thyself. And I don't really have a good answer, honestly, but I know your identity isn't your job. It isn't the people you know, how much money you have. It isn't anything that's it isn't anything that's subjective to change. And the universe is change. So maybe we don't have a self, but I don't. That doesn't feel right to me. I do believe we have a self, but it's all internal. And it's nothing outside of you. Nothing outside of you is your identity. Where you live, people identify with a sports team. They say we. Ridiculous. People identify with a town. They say, I was born here. Ridiculous. I think we're all, citizens of the world, citizens of the universe. We are all born on planet Earth. Why do we subject ourselves to an identity of a small location on this huge rock that we had no control over? It's cool, I guess, and okay to take pride in where you come from, but you can't let it be your whole identity. Like, I'm American, but that was not any will of my own. I was just plopped on a rock and then lived like 6-7 years before I even, maybe 5 years before I even became conscious. And then I was like, oh, I'm American. Like, it, not subject to will means nothing to me. That's what the Stoics say. If it's not within your control, then it's nothing. Because if you put your well-being in things outside of your control, you're bound to become miserable. You're bound to become miserable because they're all subject to change. If you put your well-being in your body, your body is subject to change. You could get sick, you could get a disease, you lose limbs, and I can promise you one thing: you're gonna die. So if your well-being is in your body, seeing your body deteriorate in old age, you're gonna be distraught. That's why the Stoics, they care about the body, but they understand it's on loan, and they understand it's not their own. Your body, like I said, anything subject to change cannot be you. And I forget the exact numbers or the exact verbiage for what the thing is, but it's like 7 years ago, you have, like, none of the cells you have right now in your body were there 7 years ago. It's something like that. Like, it's always just changing. And so it's like, I'm 22, so it's like 3 times in my life I've gone through cycles of completely different cells. Like, that can't be me. That can't be me. It's not my identity. My body, skin is dying and falling off all the time. My face has changed. I've grown. I'm not the same person I was body wise when I was 10 years old. The body is subjective to change. It's not subject to will. It's not within our control. So the Stoics say, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. Treat it well. Your body's on loan. They would say, like, treat it like it's a gift from the heavens and treat it well. But also treat it as if you may need to return it at any moment, and return it in a way that shows you are grateful for the gift you were given. So this is not a invitation to treat your body horribly and not upkeep it and be a couch potato and not upkeep your body. That's not an invitation, because the Stoics say, it's like say someone lets you borrow their car. What do you do if someone lets you borrow their car? If you're, I don't know, if you thought about it and you're decent, you'd fill up the gas tank for them. Even if you got the car with it half full, you'd return the car with the full gas. It's just common courtesy. And that's what the Stoics say you should do with your body. You were given this thing, but don't give it back empty. Give it back full. Give it back like you were grateful for having it. And there's no better way to show you're grateful than treating something right. You should leave places better than you found them. And that just, to me, is close to the same concept of, everything we have is a gift. So you should treat it right, treat it with respect, but always remember that it can be taken back at any moment. The Stoic would also say, never allow things to be torn away from you. Only view it as being returned from which it came, and be grateful for the time you had with it. And understand when you have things, Marcus Aurelius tells himself in Meditations that be grateful for all that you have and remind yourself how much you would want it if you didn't have it. But then he reminds himself, he says, wait, but don't love it so much that if you lost it, you'd be distraught. Remember, it's all on loan. This is why I believe there's so much practical wisdom, and there's no faith necessary. The Stoics do have a little bit of faith, I believe. They talk a lot about the logos. They talk a lot about nature. They talk a lot about fate, fortune. They talk a lot about the gods and wanting things to happen the way they do, because trusting that everything has to happen the way it does. But all that stuff, I believe you can come to rationally. Marcus Aurelius, again, says, want things to happen as they do, no greater harmony. You can come to that conclusion rationally without saying, I believe in a God who makes everything happen for a reason. Well, you can say, well, he says there's no greater harmony than wanting things to happen as they do. Is that true? Well, if I want everything to happen the way that it does, instead of fighting against things outside of my control, I probably will be more harmonious. Rationally, you can come to the conclusion right then and there. It's better to want things to happen as they do than to fight against things that are outside of your control. You can come to all the conclusions rationally. You don't need blind faith in anything, which is why I believe it's the most practical philosophy. And it takes stuff out of many great philosophies like cynicism. Cynicism, I've clarified it on here before, but if you've never heard me clarify it, Stoicism came out of cynicism, kind of. And the OG cynicism was not like cynicism nowadays. The OG cynicism was an honorable pursuit. Let's say that. It wasn't thinking the world had no meaning and that there's no chance or we shouldn't have hope in anything. That's not what OG cynicism is. Not even close. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about cynicism, so I won't dig into it. But I do know that it was a noble pursuit back in the day where they tried to live with as little as possible to prove that you don't need much to live a good, happy life. Diogenes, one of the most famous cynic, lived in a little jar and had no belongings but was said to be very happy and is said to be very wise and needed very little. And he just wanted to prove that a good life was not needed, did not need to be, to live a good life did not need all these external things. So that's kind of where stoicism comes. But they're not as hardcore as the cynics in, disregarding all externals. They believe in, like I said, preferable indifferences. To live in a house or to live on the ground. A cynic would say, well, you don't need the house, so you should sleep on the ground. And the stoic would say, well, I prefer the house. I'm not sacrificing any wisdom or virtue living in a house. I'll probably be better off anyways. I might as well live in the house. But if the stoic loses his house, he won't complain. He'll sleep on the ground. And that's kind of where they differ, from my understanding. But I mean, that's really why I believe stoicism over so many other things. The practical wisdom, the the almost instruction guide on how to live a good life, how to live a life with wanting little and being satisfied with little, while not focusing on things outside of your control, while finding meaning inside, but while also getting to that point of joy and peace in yourself where you can go on limbs and you can go help society, you can go help your community, and you don't get distraught when you're not, you know, being successful or getting treated right. You find joy from inside, so you're okay, and you're helping out the human race. So you're doing what you're meant to do, they would say. There's just so much practical wisdom, and it's not a selfish philosophy. It's a philosophy for, the Stoics would say you have an obligation to go into um, a public domain, politics. They would say that's where you can go help the most. And obviously, Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, and he showed that in his laws, the things that he did, that he was for the people. He, when they were going through a plague, he refused to leave Rome. He said he will stand with his people. He didn't sacrifice, like I said, life and death. He preferred life, but he wasn't going to sacrifice his virtue for it. So he stayed in Rome and ended up dying of the plague. When Rome was going through a hard time, he sold he had like a yard sale of all the furniture and the goods in the palace to raise money for Rome. He passed a law to have the gladiators use wooden swords so they wouldn't kill each other. He did a lot of things to help out Rome. He was considered one of the 5 good emperors, the last of the 5 good emperors. He never lost his temper with his people. He said he would never have a senator executed during his reign. And that sounds kind of like weird for someone to say, but you gotta remember these emperors of Rome would do that. They'd exile people who disagreed with them. They'd kill people who stood up against them. And Marcus Aurelius said he would never do that. Marcus Aurelius was betrayed by Avidius Cassius, one of his generals, and he went to war against him because Marcus Aurelius, most of his career was fought. Most of his career was at war because people were trying to, the barbarians, I think they called them, were trying to take Roman land. So he had to defend, and then he was in one corner, and one of his generals was in another corner, and then he thought he was entitled to be an emperor, so he claimed to be emperor and claimed that Marcus Aurelius was dead and had a big army. So Marcus Aurelius decided that he had to go, stand up for himself and for Rome. And but Marcus Aurelius said that he didn't want to kill him. He didn't want to kill anybody that betrayed him, because a lot of the troops went to the side of the general and was ready to go into a civil war. But then because a lot of them believe Marcus was dead, but he wasn't. So once word got to him that Marcus wasn't dead, people on the general side ended up assassinating him. So he died, and then Marcus Aurelius forgave everyone who, not I think he, I don't know, he may have had a couple people executed, but I mean it's just way different times. But it was also a huge coup that almost brought Rome into a civil war that destroyed it while they were already at war with another country, you know. So a couple people might have got executed. I can't remember, but for the most part, sent he didn't have he didn't make people, like slaves or send them to jail. He let them stay in the army, and he let them, you know, continue as they were. Like they didn't just try to overthrow him and Rome and go into a civil war. He never tried to make a decision based off anger. The Stoic would say conquering yourself is the most worthy thing to conquer. No city, not people, not a business, not a market, yourself. That is what one should cultivate conquering. Your anger, your desires, your lust, all those things. That's what a Stoic aims at conquering. And they say that's the weightiest thing to conquer. That's the most valuable thing one can conquer. And Seneca was also a politician. He was he's kind of a weird politician because a lot of people he gets a bad rap because he was Nero's like advisor, I think would be the right terminology, like philosophy advisor. And a lot of people don't know if Seneca was just, you know, being corrupted or not being corrupted, but was, around Nero, like the most corrupt emperor ever, and wasn't doing anything. Or they also say that, Seneca realized how corrupt Nero was and was trying to help, was trying to fix Nero for the sake of Rome. And he put himself, right in front of the lion, right in the lion's den to try to do it. And Nero ended up telling Seneca to kill himself. So in the end, Seneca did die because of Nero, but he was his advisor for a long time, trying to people scapulate, be a word of wisdom to him and make him not be a tyrant, even though he was a tyrant. And in the end, Seneca died because of it. And then Epictetus was teacher of philosophy, which is, I think, just as valiant as, being a political, he's still helping the youth and he's still helping people being a teacher. And then same with Musonius Rufus. He was Epictetus' teacher. And Musonius Rufus allowed slaves and girls to be in his classroom, which, this was 2,000 years ago. That wasn't normal for slaves and girls to be allowed to study philosophy. But Musonius Rufus said that virtue shows it doesn't discriminate. Virtue does not discriminate. Virtue is the same in men, girls, slave, free men. It doesn't matter, he said. Then you got Cato, who I talked about earlier. He was in politics, and he was actually, I'm pretty sure he was around during Julius Caesar, and he was trying to overthrow Julius Caesar before, Julius Caesar was assassinated. He was trying to stop the tyrant from taking over Rome. So all these Stoics, that's another reason why I really like Stoicism compared to something like, Buddhism, where you almost run away from your problems in Buddhism. You go meditate, you go get enlightened, and then you just sit around and not worry about anything. But a Stoic says, no, you get enlightened, but then for that reason headstorm into the worst case scenarios to try to help, to try to fix the world. Socrates was always in public affairs, and he was always trying to improve people, and he ended up being murdered or being exiled and executed for it. Not exiled, just executed. He ended up getting executed and having to drink hemlock because he was quote unquote corrupting the youth of Athens when he really was just questioning people and questioning things. And yeah, he was sent to death. and forced to drink hemlock. But he never, and that's why the Stoics loved Socrates, because he did stuff like that. He was in the middle of public affairs trying to improve people, but he never complained. He welcomed his fate. He said, okay, I'll drink the hemlock, even though he had a chance to escape, even though he didn't have to do it. He could have not drank the hemlock. He could have begged for exile. He could have begged for mercy, but he didn't. He stood in court and he basically told everyone that the trial wasn't against him. The trial was against them, to how they would prosecute Socrates, a man who did no wrong. He would say it's better to be wronged than to do wrong, and he was wronged. So he didn't care though, because it's better to be wrong than to do wrong. And he says, lying and saying that I did all these things I didn't do is wrong, but me telling them straight up and them wronging me, there's nothing wrong with that. At least not for me. It shows more about them than me. But the Athenians, or the Athens, the Athenians, they didn't like that, so they exiled, or they sent him to drink hemlock. But that's why the Stoics loved Socrates, because of stuff like that. He didn't sacrifice his virtue and wisdom for anything, not even life. And I could go on more about how Stoicism and why Stoicism over so many other pursuits. But I think the main point is just the tranquility you will receive, the not longing for the things outside of your control. And another thing Epictetus says is, what is a tragedy other than an external circumstance that didn't go our way? And it's so true. Like, what else is a tragedy other than when you put your well-being in an external and it doesn't go the way you planned it? That is like the definition of a tragedy. And it's when you put your well-being into externals. So why wouldn't you want to avoid tragedies if at all possible? The Stoics welcome you to a life of freedom, a life of self-mastery, a life of peace, tranquility, wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. What's so bad about that?